Okay, so now we're going to take a look at a Flex layout demo, and basically what I have here is an index.html with a blue sky root component, and in that root component I have a child component which is green. Now the child component, I think I called it flex.component. It has a container which is flexed, and the buttons inside of there are flex items. And so the bottom line is we're going to just demonstrate different attributes of the container, the green container itself, as well as the button items themselves. So there's certain directives you use for the green container, there's certain directives you use for the buttons to try to align them. Now, remember what we said in our lectures is that there's a main axis, a row direction, which could be a flex direction, which could be row, it could be column. And notice, and I have these items in my flex container, and I'm controlling a little bit about saying, you know, this button should be aligned this way, and this button should be aligned this way, and these sizes might vary, and I'll just show you. We'll just fool around with some attributes and try to change things. In addition, when I minimize my window, I basically start switching to a column flex direction, in which case start is to the left and end is to the right, and so I see a different view. Now let's not get too hung up in details. Let me just try to show you the application code, and we'll take a look at what we can do to understand this a little bit better. So I call the Angular project I'm using is Flexlayout. It's Angular 6, and I installed the Flexlayout module, which is also version 6. And so let's take a look at this in presentation mode. And so my scaffolding gave me all these things, and what I'm going to do is focus right on the index.html does have the app root, and of course the main.ts is my driver that bootstraps my app module. If I go into the app module, I see that I have several different components that I'm using, but in particular I import the common module, the Flex Layout module, and I have to import that Flex Layout module in order to use it. And some of the scaffolding might have created different things, but the bottom line is you need to import the common module and the Flex Layout module to make this work. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure that things changed between Angular 4, 5, and 6. But so now I know that I'm bootstrapping my app component, and I'm also using these two components, app component and flex component. Now I could say right off the bat that the flex component is the child of the root component, app component, but I need to verify that to make sure by going into the app component and let's say the template and seeing that I'm actually using the app flex. So therefore it is a child of the root component, and so let's take a look at the module itself. It doesn't really do much. It has a selector, template, style sheet, and I'm just using it as a container for my Flex demo component, which is in this directory, Flex. And so here's my tag that's really the child component, which I'm really doing a demonstration on now. I have a div tag and a container here, and just to show you the style, I'm just trying to center things and define the fonts and stuff like that. There's nothing that fascinating about the container styling that I'm using, but I just wanted to make sure that that my title gets rendered the way I like seeing it, etc. So the styles I used here were Verdana. I typically use Arial, but now let's just go to the Flex component. So since the Flex component has this selector, and of course I have to verify that in the Flex component. But it does look like a custom tag, and it does, if it's associated with the Flex component, then the Flex component is the child of this root component. So we go here, the selector is app Flex, and so yeah, we're dealing with a child component here. So this is the component. I have developed and exported a class Flex component, and I have a couple of functions here. One is mobile, returns true, and invisible on desktop returns false. So I'm going to change these values and see how it changes my application. But the reason why I have those two functions there is I want to point out that that I'm going to use the Flexlayout module to declare some properties using directives, and those properties can be based on functions or dynamic values, change detection, property binding, etc. Okay, so let's take a look at the component itself. Okay, so this is really the crux of my demo. It's really using the static API of the Flexlayout component. Okay, so now Flexlayout comes with static API, which is really just the directives inside the HTML, and also a JavaScript API, which is really dynamic things like observable media, breakpoints, and other things, other adapters that you might use. Okay, so this is the simplest form of using the Flexlayout. Now what you'll find is you really should know Flexbox well enough to try to understand the meaning of some of these directives. And another thing I'm going to point out is this directive-based approach for laying out items in a container is used very widely in Ionic 4. As a matter of fact, Ionic 4 has custom web components and that use what they call utilities. I kind of view as directives to basically lay out your components, and you're doing it on a mobile device, so it's very, very convenient. Okay, so anyway, getting back to the Flexlayout module, we have an outer div tag, and we have flex items. Okay, so I think before we do that, let's take a look at the styling. Okay, so the goal behind using the directives was to, Flexbox does everything in the style sheet. Flexlayout module does mostly everything in the template. And so there's a difference there, but also it's more powerful as far as UI component tree and understanding the UI component tree and the hierarchy of elements. Okay, so let's take a look at the style sheet real quick. The div styling is really just for the fonts, but I also did put a height on here, which I'll change later to auto, just to show you the difference. There's some padding and there's font style and background light green, etc. Nothing really layoutish, with the exception of the padding and the height. But we'll see that I specifically changed the height here just to give you an idea of what the thing looks like. And I'm going to go back and change this to auto and maybe even remove it if we can. Okay, so looking at the Flex component template, we have a div container, and I'm defining certain attributes. The Flex layout is wrap, which means, you know, if the real estate gets too small, start wrapping the items in the container on a multi-line. Um, and I'll and we'll take a look at removing that. And also, there's a flex layout align, which allows you to align the items in the container. And I could do a space around, a space between, and all this other stuff. And there's a main axis and there's a cross axis, right, which goes perpendicular to it. So so the main container says center the items on the cross axis, but put a space around all the other items, and put a space around all the items, and then I have a flex layout gap, which is 4 pixels, and if the layout size is for mobile, I'm going to display it as common. Okay, so I got these main constraints around the container. So before, and then once I do that, the items, the flex items inside can have flex attributes as well. And I make a point to say, you know, I could do a lot of different things which look better than others, but let's just quickly look at the demo and take a look at the way the items are being flexed. Okay, so first of all, I basically defined some flex item attributes so I could change the size of these things, and then like I said, this is the cross axis, so I start this button here and I put this button at the end, and this size differences of the buttons, etc. So let's just see what happens when we change the size of this. Notice to mobile, it gets column oriented, and all of a sudden things change. Okay, this is the start of that cross axis. This is the end of that cross axis, because the cross axis and the main axis have switched in the mobile environment. So what you'll notice is as you increase, it changes, and we'll simplify this a little bit in a minute. Okay, so now button 1 has 20%. So basically, you got this you got this flex container, and you laid out the buttons and a space in between. And now I'm saying I want this button 1 to be 20%, and I also say button 4 is 20, which I believe is the same thing. And I say button 5 is 10. So button 5 is 10%. So what we can do, since we know what those are just resizing. And then I also do a flex align start on this button 2, and a flex align end on button 3. So start on button 2 and end on button 3. Now this is 10%. Now you question, what is this 10% of? This button 5, like the size, it's 10%. But of what is it? And I'm going to ask the question so you could think about it. But you really have to look at your styles to really determine the calculation. So the space around the buttons, and I think what Flex probably did was looked and how to equally space the buttons at the same time, make this a 10% of whatever's available after the spacing happens. Let's say this one was 20%, this one was 20%, and these buttons look the same size, and something seems to be a little bit different about this button versus this button. But anyway, this isn't we're running an IE, so let's not be too concerned about things like this. But Anyway, let's go and simplify it, right? Let's go take a look at the code and say, you know what? Let me do this. Let's forget about this button being, let's forget about this line being start. Let's forget about this line being end. And let's just see now what we're dealing with here. Okay, now the buttons are aligned in the row direction, in the order. Okay, so now if we make the size smaller, the buttons align vertically for a small device, but we still have these 10%, 20%. So let's go back and fix that. Let's remove this. Let's move this. And let's take a look at what's going on here. I'm gonna get rid of this too, because the problem with the offset is it you know, you have to understand the whole effects of all the styles combined and what happens. So let's go back and take a look at what's happening here now. Button 1 is still large. Button 1. Let's get rid of that one. Okay, now we have the buttons showing equally spaced in mobile device. Okay, now there's something else you might have noticed. Okay, button 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, let's see how many buttons we have here. Well, we have 7 buttons, and button 6. What we're saying here with this directive, we're saying this for the small devices, hide is calculated dynamically with this is mobile. So if it's true, it gets hidden. If not, it gets shown. So right now it's I think it's false. So this evaluates the false. But the change detection and the dynamic binding can be any real-time value. Okay, so you could subscribe to a result and you could see a result that it's a mobile device, and then hide this thing or show it or whatever it may be. Just have the user click on something and change the value in the component instance. Okay, and things will change. Okay, so that was button number 6. Let's take a look at that. Button number 6 is not displaying here. Now button 6 is displaying. Okay. Now let's do this. This says invisible on desktop. Is it invisible on desktop? Well, when we look at the function, it says false. So let's change that to true. And that should make it such that button 7 will be hidden when the viewport is the size of a desktop, let's say. So for large devices, I hide button 7. Button 7 is no longer being shown. Okay, so let's do this. Let's try a couple more things. First of all, this is space around. What happens if we do space between Now the buttons get aligned left and right, and there's space between the buttons. And let's see what that looks like in the mobile world. So the button, it will go flush against the component up here in the green if I didn't put that padding of that green device. That green component, I really put a padding on it, I think. Okay, so let's go back and just take a look at that. Yeah, there was a 5 padding on the div. If we change that to 0, what would we see? Yeah, it goes flush up against the back. Now, you know, if I went back here and I just said space around, then basically what I would see is this. So I like keeping things as simple as possible. I love the space around because typically, although my component might not look you know, well formatted, the truth of the matter is if I go up here and I do a height, let me try to change this height to auto. What'll happen is now it, you know, there's a space, there's spaces between the buttons, but it's kind of well formatted. Now there is something else there which in my component template, which was the gap. Now the gap, let's see if this changes the boundary and make things look better. Yeah, it didn't work at all. What happened? Flex layout gap. Okay, that's centered. Oh, my padding is no longer there. Okay, so that's that. The space around did not affect the spacing against the borders. So that was that's probably why I put it there. Now in this scenario, it seems to do a space around properly, but it's also the auto height of the component as well. So just be careful of those gotchas. And so let's see what did I do? I had a padding here, 5. And it's still bothering me. I don't really want that padding, but let's move on because I have some other things I want to show you. Okay, so now if we go back here, you know, we have the we have space around the buttons, which looks pretty decent. Now if I go back into here and I go and try to change that gap again, let's suppose I make it 10 pixels. Let's see what happens with the, yeah, so it's a little bit more spaced out, the gap here. Okay, so let's see if there's anything else I need to show you here. There was that invisible on desktop. We kind of saw that happen, right? It returns true, it's hard-coded, and it hides button 7. For smaller devices, it hides button 6. So 7 is being hidden here in the desktop. 6 is being hidden in the mobile. And now you notice 6 and 7 are showing. And eventually 7 will get hidden. So very flexible, and there's other things that you can do. Let me see if I could replace everything I did in this file. And so let's just see what happens here when I do this. Now I've resized some of the buttons, and like I said, these don't have to be buttons. Usually I use material design cards. They're actually components. I have a flex container, and I put a bunch of components in my flex container, and usually they're material design cards that are floating around with functionality. And when I go to mobile, they just display vertically. When I go to desktop, they display and they float, and etc. So that's really all I want to show on this demo.